dat hadden we nog jaren kunnen doen. Maar na 2 keer een familiereunie-achtige dingen dachten we van, we gaan het anders doen. En vorig jaar hebben we Huda Abifaris gehad over Arabische typografie. En vandaag dus Alice Twemlow over... zij gaat het straks zelf introduceren, want het is een knap ingewikkeld verhaal, vind ik. Het is, Alice is lector design aan de Koninklijke Academie in Den Haag en de Universiteit van Leiden. Maar zij is nog veel meer. Zij is ook lid van de AGI, terwijl ze geen ontwerper is. Dus dat is best bijzonder eigenlijk. Maar ook weer fantastisch dat zij hier is, want dit weekend is het AGI-congres in Parijs. Waardoor veel grafisch ontwerpers van naam en faam in Parijs zijn. Tot zover mijn korte introductie. Ik ben heel blij, Alice, dat jij... that you want to give the first Wim Crouwel lecture. And please, come forward. Yes.
Thank you very much. My Dutch friends can tell me later what you said. Thanks to Rob and to the WIm Crouwel Institute and Harriet and Amber and Steph of the Special Collections of the University of Amsterdam and all they do to collect, preserve and interpret the legacy of graphic design. It's no ordinary honour to be delivering a lecture here under the name of Wim Crouwel. He has inspired many of us here, I think, in not just how to be a designer, a modernist, and a gentleman, or a gentle human for that matter. But he's also been influential to me personally as a writer about design, as someone who seeks to understand design in all its dimensionality. And I've met with Wim a few times over the years, and my conversations with him always impress in me that design can be something philosophical, something lived, a way of seeing the world, and a contribution to the way the world sees itself. He shows me that design has depth as well as surface. So here he is, when we first moved to Amsterdam 2 years ago, very kindly advising my son, who was 6 at the time, on the design of his personal logo. I, of course, was terrified that my son would destroy one of the original Rietveld chairs you can see in the background. So I devised the notion that Wim could sort of oversee a little art project here. And here's the resulting logo. My son's name is Otto, O-T-T-O, so, works pretty well, I think. I think he's still using it. And here is Wim again when I interviewed him on stage in New York with Massimo Vignelli, another ambassador of modernist values. And here are their grids. We have Wim's on the left and Massimo's on the right. And here we see Crouwel's grid in action in this poster for the 1968 Stedelijk Museum exhibition, Vormgevers. Give it a go. Here deployed not just as a matrix for controlling the placement of typography, but celebrated as a form itself, kind of exposed as the sedimentary strata of the poster. And Vignelli's Unigrid, which he designed specifically for the American National Park Service maps and leaflets. So, grids, Cartesian coordinates, geometric impositions of attempted order on geological randomness. These things are taking us slowly toward the topic of my talk, and its geographic location in a town called Aspen, high up in the Colorado Rockies. We'll go there through a different map, though. This one, titled The World Geographic Atlas of 1953, sponsored by the Container Corporation of America, and completely, it wasn't just designed or edited, those words don't say enough about it, but it was created from scratch by Herbert Bayer, the Austrian émigré. Maps, thought Bayer, could be a record of time and perhaps even a tool of prognostication, as we can see here in this complex fusion of geological and biological evolution. It was an amazing feat of map making and atlas editing, combining typography, painting, and information design to create a kind of cartographic Gesamtkunstwerk in the Bauhaus model, as we can glimpse in this physiographic map. We're zooming in on Aspen here. So Beyer moved to Aspen in 1946 and designed many of the structures that defined the modernist aesthetic of the town. Here are some of his houses, more grids in the landscape. And here he is in front of his 1952 Sgraffito wall mural, also in Aspen, which attempts to depict a mountain through its topographic representation, which you can see. And here is the tent he designed in 1966 for the Aspen Design Conference. And we're here. But to really start, I need you to picture a scene. So it's a perfect June evening in Aspen. Drinks are set out on the terrace of one of Beyer's modernist houses. As the sun begins to dip below the snow-capped mountains on this first day of the 1970 International Design Conference, a group is gathering for a cocktail party. The men are dressed in plaid jackets and ties, and their hair, if they still have any, is close-cropped and grey. Their wives wear cocktail dresses, large sunglasses, and pearls, and the hair, curled and set, barely moves in the breeze that ruffles the nearby aspen trees. They are the cognoscenti of modernist American design, the board members of the International Design Conference at Aspen. Among them, Beyer, we've already met, still dapper at 70 in his cravat and suntan. George Nelson, design director at the high-end office furniture firm Herman Miller. Saul Bass, the Los Angeles-based graphic designer, most famous for movie titles in the 50s and 60s. And Elliot Noyes, design director at IBM and president of the Aspen Conference since 1965. So these men have helped to define the American graphic and industrial design professions in the 40s and 50s. Their careers flourished in the post-war period of economic expansion and are tied to the rise of a consumer society. Now in middle age, they hold prominent positions within the professional design community and the flagship corporations of the day. But while these representatives of the American design elite laugh, clink glasses, and pat one another on the back in collegial amiability, in the meadow beyond, a very different scenario is taking shape. Here are student designers and architects, some of their young teachers. With their waist-length hair, beards, open-neck shirts, bandanas, and jean jackets, these groups signal both their adherence to an alternative lifestyle, for which Berkeley in California was the unofficial American capital, and their distance from the middle-aged East Coast conference organizers we've just met. Among the groups arriving are members of the San Francisco media collective called Ant Farm. And by 1970, they were pretty well known for their use of inflatable structures as the setting for free-form architectural performances, and their experiments with video as a vehicle for critique. In a biographical statement, Ant Farm characterized themselves as, quote, an extended family of environmentalists, artists, designers, builders, actors, cooks, lifers, and an inflatable named Frank, war babies, television children, rod and custom subscribers, university-trained media freaks, and hippies, interested in balancing the environment by total transformation of existing social and economic systems, end quote. We're going to be hearing that phrase quite a bit. Since the theme of the conference this year is Environment by Design, several representatives of environmental action groups are also gathering, invited by this guy, Sim van der Ryn, who is an assistant professor of architecture at the University of California, Berkeley, and founder of the Farallones Institute. Among them are the Environmental Workshop and Zoneworks, which develop many of the housing structures for communes such as Drop City. And also in this gaggle of groups arriving is Cliff Humphrey, founder of Ecology Action, and he was the originator of the first drop-off recycling center in the US. And his Berkeley commune, which was best known for smashing and burying cars, has just been featured in a New York Times Magazine cover story pushing a globe in a baby stroller. So those are the two main sets of protagonists in this story, but there's a third group. And this group includes the French philosopher and sociologist Jean Baudrillard and the architect Jean Aubert. They are members of Utopie, a Paris-based collective that since 1966 has been engaged in radical leftist critique of commodity production and capitalism. So here then are three very different tribes, each with its own design principles, its own conception of what the environment means, and its own critical methods. To the conference organizers, design is a problem-solving activity, albeit with roots in architecture and the fine arts, primarily in the service of commerce, part of a modernist tradition, or at least the version that has been absorbed into the American military-industrial complex. Their approach to discourse is a kind of reasonable pragmatism in which it's possible to debate points of difference toward consensus. In the environmentalists' and students' view, as this poster tells us, taste and style just aren't enough. Design needs to claim responsibility for the repercussions of its activities and should be understood in terms of interconnected systems and natural resources. And their chosen critical methods are dissensus, protest, and action encounters. And the French delegation? Well, they object to both conceptions, perceiving the entire theme of design and environment as constituting a generalized utopia produced by a capitalist system that assures the appearance of a second nature in order to survive and perpetuate itself under the pretext of nature. End quote. And their preferred weapon alternates between refusal and structuralist critique. So, with such different worldviews and reference bases at play, and the prospect of a week in one another's company, an ideological collision of some significance seems likely. And the result of the clash was, this is kind of how I frame it anyway, a blow to the tenets of modernism. The most iconic of the blows was this one, where the failed social housing project known as Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, Missouri, had to be demolished. And that detonation became emblematic of a perceived failure in public urban planning, to the extent that the postmodern architect Charles Jenks could say, quote, "Modern architecture died in St. Louis, Missouri on July 15th, 1972 at 3:32 p.m. or thereabouts," end quote. The clash at Aspen also contributed, I think, a changed conception in the popular imagination of design's relationship to the environment. And it was very much to do with this image, which I'll come back to later. And it also caused a rupture too, another collapse even, of design criticism as a mode of practice, ending up with these kind of much more theatrical, performative, embodiments of critique. So these are the interrelated themes I want to develop in my talk today. We've got modernism, we've got ecology, and we've got a design criticism, and it's all happening in the context of the emergence, really, I suppose, of an epoch beginning to be known as the Anthropocene. But first, let's take a closer look at what happened during that week in June in the Colorado Rockies. A little bit of historical context. The International Design Conference at Aspen was conceived in 1951. It was supposed to be a kind of high-altitude forum for designers and businessmen to discuss the shared interests of culture and commerce at a far remove from their everyday concerns. And its founder was Walter Pepke, who with his wife Elizabeth had helped develop Aspen from a deserted silver mining town into a winter ski resort and summer cultural festival destination. In 1950, Pepke had established the Aspen Institute of Humanistic Studies, and the design conference, which was formed as a kind of offshoot of this institute, borrowed its humanist values and its exalted language, referring to design, for example, as, quote, in its larger concept as one of the most important distinguishing features of our civilization, end quote. Pepke was also president of the Chicago-based packaging company, the Container Corporation of America, which was pretty well known for its integrated corporate design and its embrace of the good design equals good business mantra. Indeed, the title of the first conference was Design as a Function of Management. And so this combination of high humanist ideals and shrewd commercial pragmatism would continue to kind of undergird the conference. As the conference evolved, and particularly after Pepke died in 1960, the conference mission broadened to include almost any subject that the leadership believed was touched by design or that design touched. Scientific philosophers, microbiologists, poets, composers, for example, were typical of the participants from other professions that began to populate the speaker rosters. Aspen was notoriously difficult to reach, but the remoteness of the location was, of course, part of its appeal. Pepke had always hoped that attendees to his conference would return home renewed in body and spirit, as well as in mind. The pace was leisurely, with presentations spread out over a week and interspersed with long lunches, rambles in the mountains. A typical outdoors afternoon event was billed as, quote, a discussion and demonstration of international kites, led by Charles Eames. In fact, poor Charles Eames was often roped into the conference rosters, as you can see by this sort of rather plaintive telegram here. All we need is 15 minutes of words and 30 or 40 minutes of film. And for most of us, it will be the most important hour in the entire conference. To which he responded, I can't face it, all that nature and people, and above all, the talk about design. Poor guy. So an annual favorite was the fish fry, which was an al fresco lunch by the river. The brochure for the 1961 conference dispensed the following advice on attire. Sportswear is the norm for the daytime, and evening dining is only a shade more formal. A little black dress and mosquito repellent will do for the ladies, and a plaid coat, tie, and Bermudas for the men. End quote. The design historian Nicholas Pevsner attended the conference in 1953 and, on his return, shared his impressions with British listeners on a BBC radio broadcast. Pevsner was fascinated by the casual attire of the attendees, their coloured, printed, and wildly patterned shirts. You're going to have to imagine the colour here. In which he went so far as to locate the source of America's advanced progress in modern industrial design. He told his listeners, I am, as a matter of fact, quite ready to appreciate these shirts intellectually. And if that daring, that naive trust in novelty were not part of the American character, modern design of the best quality would not have made such spectacular progress in the last 10 years, end quote. So he didn't realize it was actually all down to Charles Eames's shirt, nothing else. By 1970, what had started as a experimental meeting had evolved into a robust institution. As the American cultural climate underwent dramatic change toward the end of the 60s and a younger generation of much more politicized designers emerged, the conference, which was at this point kind of representing the status quo among the higher echelons of design, was ripe for attack. Many of the attendees at the 1970 edition of the conference were aggrieved by the conference format, which they saw as outmoded. One of them said, it's curious to me that change is so long in coming to this design conference. It's one speaker and 1,000 people glued to their seats. For while the scope of the conference had expanded in terms of its content, and the theme changed from year to year, the format always remained the same. You had speakers addressing conferees from a raised stage, though not nearly as grand as this one, I have to say. And images were shown at night when it was dark enough inside the tent. So a very conventional format. And this became almost symbolic of the inadequacies of the conference leadership. This kind of one-way transmission of information from a designated expert on a raised stage to a seated audience was seen as anachronistic in this period of experimentation with new modes of communication. Many schools were being reinvented in the form of free universities or anti-universities, where the roles of teacher and student were fluid constructs. The California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, for example, was established in 1970 with a non-hierarchical approach to pedagogy, what the dean, Robert W. Corrigan, characterized as, quote, a radically different prototype for training the artist of the future, end quote. Antfarm, who visited numerous California schools during the academic year 1969 to 70, described their teaching work as, quote, response information exchanges, end quote. So that was the kind of climate that was taking shape. But far from seeing students as potential teachers or even acknowledging the student protests that had filled the streets of Paris 2 years before, to the IDCA leadership, students were just there to help out and nothing more. As they began to attend in greater numbers and they were asked to pay a fee, however, they made more demands of the conference, and in 1968, a group of them set up their own student commission to organize such demands. In 1969, the Northern Illinois University students had built a sculpture of junked cars, toilets, sinks, and old tires sprayed white, intended to represent the state of design with all of its built-in obsolescence and excess of white goods. A critical gesture and an eyesore, but basically containable within the conference and understood as a material form by the conference organizers. Whereas what the students in 1970 wanted to do was arrive at the conference in a chartered bus, giving small theatrical performances along the way. And then when they got there, they wanted to set up inflatable structures in which to hold meetings and present performances and so on. The conference leadership refused. To Elliot Noyes, who was the president, these proposals seemed to be, quote, in conflict with the conference itself, almost as a counter-conference or an anti-conference. And he was right. So the students were told there were no temporary or inflatable structures might be built on the institute grounds. The reason this was so contentious an issue, I think, is because of what had happened at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where clashes between the police and the yippies, as they were called, lasted for 8 days. And what had been at the core of those disturbances was the notion of sleeping out in tents in the parks. So, ignoring the conference organizers' stipulations, Antfarm promptly erected their spare tire inflatable, which they had created earlier that year. They got power for the air pumps from their media van in which they traveled to the conference. When they were asked why they were at the conference, a founding member of Antfarm, sporting a bushy beard, beads and dark sunglasses, explained, "We wanted to go to Boston to shut down the AIA conference." That's the American Institute of Architects conference. But we didn't have the money to get there, so we pushed buttons and pulled levers and threatened to have thousands of hippies show up in Aspen. We said we were going to put an ad in the underground newspapers in Berkeley, advertising free food and hanging out with Aquarian-age architects and all that bullshit. I guess they bought it. End quote. And in fact, some students did go to the American Institute of Architects conference in Boston, and they did shut it down. And similarly, at the Utopia or Revolution conference, organized by the architecture department at Turin Polytechnic in 1969, Utopia member Hubert Tonka has recalled that, quote, "We held the whole conference hostage for several hours with a leftist group called the Vikings. The cops showed up with submachine guns. Oh yes, Utopia or Revolution, that was a bad scene," end quote. Also, in May 1968, radical demonstrators in Milan had protested against the elitist organization of the Milan Triennale. Its aestheticization of the Paris student protests and its reformist approach to that year's theme, which was World Population Explosion. Students erected banners that read "Murd to the falsifiers" and managed to close the triennial down only hours after it had opened, and provoked the resignation of the event's executive committee. So you can see there was a feisty lot of design students around 1970. And you know, really it was part of a growing critique against corporate modernism and rationalist approaches toward design. And it was interesting that the design event had been identified as a sort of public stage upon which to make those feelings known. So we've got a bunch of problems with the conference already. We've got its format. We've got the fact that students are already feeling antsy. But it was the theme in the year 1970 that rendered it still more vulnerable. Because it was called environment by design, but yet we had two really, really different conceptions of what the environment is going on. And that really was the conceptual fault line along which the conference would split. See, for the conference leadership, the designers, the kind of modernist group, the environment was simply an aesthetic backdrop for their designed images, products, buildings, and urban plans. They thought the environment was something that could actually be enriched and improved